On the morning of October 17, 1944, in a supply depot 20 miles behind the Allied lines in eastern France, Corporal Thomas Hendricks sat hunched over a battered wooden crate, carefully soldering wire connections onto a makeshift radio transmitter constructed from salvaged bomber parts, tin cans, and copper piping from a destroyed farmhouse. The other men in his signals unit laughed openly at what they called his junkyard contraption, convinced their standard-issue field radios would never fail them. They had no idea that within 72 hours, that same homemade device would become the only thread connecting 300 trapped soldiers to survival, or that their mockery would transform into desperate gratitude when every piece of regulation equipment lay useless and silent. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how one man's stubborn ingenuity and refusal to accept conventional limitations created a lifeline across enemy territory, proving that sometimes the greatest technological achievements come not from factories and laboratories, but from necessity, determination, and a willingness to be laughed at while building something nobody else believed could work. Thomas Hendricks had grown up in rural Michigan, the son of a radio repair shop owner who taught him to coax signals from broken equipment that others had declared beyond salvation. Before the conflict began, Thomas spent his evenings in his father's workshop, surrounded by the warm glow of vacuum tubes and the smell of hot solder, learning that every component had potential if you understood its fundamental nature. He enlisted in 1942, and his technical skills quickly landed him in the Signal Corps, but his unconventional methods and constant tinkering earned him a reputation as someone who couldn't leave well enough alone. His commanding officer, Captain Robert Morrison, was a by-the-book West Point graduate who believed in equipment specifications, proper channels, and following established procedures. Morrison had made his position clear on numerous occasions. When he walked past Hendricks that October morning and saw the assemblage of mismatched parts, he stopped and shook his head with obvious disdain. "Hendricks, what in God's name is that supposed to be?" Morrison asked, his tone mixing amusement with irritation. Thomas looked up from his work, pushing his wire-rimmed glasses higher on his nose. "It's a backup transmitter, sir. I've been working on it for 3 weeks. Uses a different frequency range than our standard equipment, and I've modified the power amplification system using components from a downed reconnaissance aircraft. The signal strength should be approximately 40% stronger than regulation field units." Morrison picked up one of the copper pipes that would serve as an antenna element. "This looks like plumbing supplies, Corporal. We have perfectly good radios supplied by the finest manufacturers in America. We don't need homemade gadgets assembled from garbage. You're wasting time that could be spent maintaining our actual equipment." Several other soldiers nearby chuckled, and Private Eddie Sullivan, a young recruit from Boston, called out from across the depot, "Hey, Hendricks, when you're done with that radio, can you build me a car out of old boots and barbed wire?" The laughter echoed through the supply tent, but Thomas simply returned to his soldering. He had learned long ago that trying to explain the theoretical principles of signal propagation and frequency modulation to people who didn't want to listen was an exercise in futility. He knew what he was building, understood the mathematics behind every connection, and believed in his work even if nobody else did. Technical Sergeant William Chen, a career military man who had served in the Pacific Theater before transferring to Europe, watched the exchange with more interest than mockery. Chen had seen enough combat to know that survival often depended on improvisation, and that the soldiers who stuck rigidly to regulations sometimes found themselves without options when situations deviated from the manual. He approached Hendricks after Morrison walked away. "Does it actually work?" Chen asked quietly, examining the construction with genuine curiosity. Thomas nodded, carefully testing a connection with his multimeter. "I've been running tests at night. The transmission clarity is actually superior to the standard SCR 300 series we're using. The frequency range is wider, and I've incorporated a modulation system that should cut through interference more effectively. The only limitation is power supply, but I've solved that by adapting a portable generator linkage." Chen studied the device more carefully, noting the precision of the connections despite the unconventional materials. What made you build it? Insurance, Thomas replied simply. I've seen too many missions compromised because equipment failed at critical moments. Radio technology is reliable, but it's not infallible. Weather affects it, terrain affects it, enemy jamming affects it. Having an alternative that operates on different principles and different frequencies seemed like reasonable preparation. Morrison will never authorize its use in the field, Chen observed. I know, Thomas said, but I'll have it ready anyway, just in case. What none of them knew was that just 60 miles to the east, the German forces were preparing a significant counteroffensive that would isolate an entire battalion of Allied troops in a matter of days. The military planners had assured everyone that the sector was secure, that supply lines were protected, and that communication networks were redundant and reliable. Like most assurances made in wartime, these would prove tragically optimistic. 3 days later, on October 20th, the situation transformed with devastating speed. A coordinated operation by the German army of that era exploited a gap in Allied reconnaissance, pushing armored columns through a supposedly secure valley and effectively surrounding the 2nd Battalion of the 341st Infantry Regiment. The battalion, consisting of 307 men under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Whitmore, suddenly found themselves cut off from supply lines, surrounded on 3 sides, and desperately trying to establish contact with headquarters to coordinate extraction or reinforcement. Whitmore was a veteran of the North African campaign, experienced enough to recognize how quickly a tactical situation could deteriorate. His immediate priority was communication. Without contact, headquarters would have no way of knowing their exact position, their condition, or their needs. He ordered his communications team to establish contact, using every available radio in the battalion. But the geographical reality of their position worked against them. The battalion was trapped in a narrow valley, surrounded by steep ridges that blocked direct line-of-sight transmission. The standard field radios, designed for relatively flat terrain and clear paths, struggled to push signals over the mountain barriers. Static and interference plagued every frequency they tried. The communications sergeant, a capable technician named Frank Rodriguez, worked frantically to boost signal strength, repositioning antennas, adjusting frequencies and attempting every technical trick he knew. We're getting nothing, sir, Rodriguez reported to Whitmore after 2 hours of continuous attempts. The terrain is blocking everything. We need higher ground or more powerful equipment. These field units just don't have the range to punch through these ridges with enough clarity for effective communication. Whitmore studied his maps, calculating distances and angles. Can you get a team to that peak? He pointed to a ridge approximately 2 miles north of their position. Rodriguez shook his head. That's exposed ground, sir. The German positions have clear sight lines to anywhere high enough to make a difference for transmission. We'd lose the team before they could set up, and we'd lose the equipment too. We can't afford either. Back at the Allied headquarters, the silence from 2nd Battalion triggered immediate concern. Major General Howard Fletcher, commanding the regional operations, convened his staff to assess the situation. Aerial reconnaissance had confirmed the German advance and the probable encirclement, but without direct communication from Whitmore, they had no precise information about the battalion's status, position, or immediate needs. We need to establish contact, Fletcher stated flatly. Without communication, any rescue or supply operation is guesswork. We could send resources to the wrong location, or worse, send men into a situation we don't understand. What are our options? Captain Morrison, now serving at headquarters for the operation, outlined the attempts. We've been broadcasting on all standard frequencies, sir. No response from 2nd Battalion. Either their equipment is compromised, they're being jammed, or the terrain is preventing effective transmission. We've tried relay stations, different frequencies, everything in the operational manual. How long before we lose them entirely? Fletcher asked. The intelligence officer, Colonel Patricia Hawkins, consulted her notes. Based on their last known supply status, they have approximately 4 to 5 days of ammunition, medical supplies, and rations. After that, they're vulnerable to being overrun or forced to attempt a breakout, which would result in significant casualties given the strength of the opposing positions. We're looking at a narrow window, sir. Fletcher stared at the map. the weight of 307 lives pressing on every decision. Keep trying every conventional method, and start preparing a rescue operation based on best estimates. We may have to go in blind. Back at the supply depot, Thomas Hendricks heard about the situation through the informal network of soldiers sharing cigarettes and rumors. The moment he understood that 2nd Battalion was surrounded and unable to communicate, he felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. He knew exactly why their radios weren't working and what might solve the problem, but he also knew that convincing anyone to try his homemade device would be nearly impossible. Technical Sergeant Chen found him that evening, sitting beside his completed radio, running final tests on the frequency modulation system. "You heard about 2nd Battalion?" Chen asked. Thomas nodded without looking up from his work. "The terrain is blocking them. Standard radios don't have the power or the right frequency characteristics to penetrate those ridges effectively. They need either much higher power or a different approach to signal propagation." "Like what your contraption offers?" Chen asked. "Exactly like what this offers," and Thomas replied, finally meeting Chen's eyes. "I designed it specifically for difficult terrain situations. The frequency range I'm using should experience less attenuation through rock and earth. The power amplification system, even though it looks like assembled junk, produces a stronger signal than our field units. And I've incorporated a modulation technique that enhances clarity in high-interference environments. This could reach them." Chen sat down on an empty ammunition crate. "Morrison will never authorize it. He barely trusts regulation equipment, and he certainly won't trust something built from bomber parts and tin cans. Then 300 soldiers will remain silent until they run out of supplies or get overrun," Thomas said quietly. "I'm not saying this is guaranteed to work. I'm saying it has a chance when nothing else does, and that chance might be the difference between life and death for those men." The two soldiers sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the decision hanging between them. Chen had served long enough to know when rules needed to be bent and when they needed to be broken. He also knew that trying and failing with an unauthorized device could result in court-martial for everyone involved. "How confident are you?" Chen asked finally. Thomas considered the question carefully, running through every calculation and test result in his mind. 70%, maybe 75. The theory is solid, the components are functional, and the tests I've run indicate it should work. But I can't account for every variable until we actually try it under real conditions. Chen stood up. Decision made. "Pack it up. We're going to headquarters." "Morrison will stop us," Thomas pointed out. "Morrison is at headquarters," Chen replied. "Which means he's not here. And by the time anyone asks questions, we'll already know if this works. Sometimes it's easier to ask forgiveness than permission, especially when lives are hanging in the balance." They loaded the radio equipment into a jeep, along with the portable generator, and drove through the darkening evening toward the command post. Thomas felt his heart pounding, aware that he was risking his career and possibly his freedom on a device that had never been tested beyond the limited trials he could conduct secretly. But he also knew that doing nothing while possessing a potential solution was its own kind of failure, one he couldn't accept. At headquarters, they found the communications center in a state of barely controlled chaos. Radio operators cycled through frequencies, adjusting equipment, broadcasting calls into static-filled silence. The tension was palpable, each passing hour reducing the window for effective rescue. Chen approached the senior communications officer, Major Douglas Armstrong, a pragmatic veteran who valued results over protocols. "Major, we have a possible solution to the 2nd Battalion situation," Chen said, speaking with the confidence of a senior sergeant who had earned the right to be heard. "Corporal Hendricks has constructed an alternative radio system that might break through the terrain interference." Armstrong looked up from a frequency chart, his expression mixing hope with skepticism. "What kind of alternative system?" Thomas stepped forward, carrying the main components of his radio. In the harsh fluorescent light of the command center, the device looked even more improvised than usual, a chaotic assembly of mismatched parts that seemed more likely to explode than transmit. He saw several officers exchange glances, the same dismissive looks he had endured for weeks. "Sir, this transmitter operates on a modified frequency band with enhanced power amplification, Thomas explained, speaking quickly to get the technical details out before he could be interrupted. The standard field radios are experiencing high attenuation through the mountain terrain. This system uses different signal propagation characteristics that should penetrate rock and earth more effectively. I've also incorporated improved modulation that enhances clarity in high static environments. Armstrong studied the device, then looked at Thomas with the weariness of someone who had dealt with countless well-meaning but impractical suggestions during his career. "Corporal, we appreciate initiative, but we're working with proven, tested equipment here. We don't have time for experiments." "With respect, sir, the proven equipment isn't working," Chen interjected. "2nd Battalion has been silent for 8 hours. Every conventional method has failed. This might be unconventional, but it represents an option we haven't tried. What do we have to lose by attempting it?" Before Armstrong could respond, Captain Morrison entered the communications center and immediately spotted Hendricks with his homemade radio. His face darkened with anger. "Corporal Hendricks, what are you doing here with that junk? This is a command center, not a repair workshop for hobby projects." Thomas straightened, forcing himself to meet Morrison's hostile gaze. "Sir, I believe this equipment can establish contact with 2nd Battalion when our standard radios cannot. I'm requesting permission to attempt communication." Morrison's response was immediate and sharp. "Absolutely not. We're conducting serious military operations here, not science experiments. Remove that contraption and return to your assigned duties immediately." "That's a direct order." The room fell silent, dozens of personnel watching the confrontation. Thomas felt the familiar weight of dismissal, the same casual rejection of his ideas that he had experienced throughout his military service. Part of him wanted to simply comply, pack up his equipment, and let the proper authorities handle the situation with their proper equipment and proper procedures. But another part of him, the part that had spent 3 weeks carefully soldering connections and running calculations, couldn't accept walking away when he possessed something that might save 307 lives. "Sir, I respectfully request that Major Armstrong be allowed to make that decision," Thomas said, his voice steady despite his racing pulse. "This communication center is under his command, and the situation is urgent enough to warrant trying every available option." Morrison stepped closer, his face inches from Thomas's. "Are you refusing a direct order, Corporal?" Before Thomas could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Let him try." General Fletcher had entered the communications center unnoticed, drawn by the commotion. He had been observing the exchange, studying both the improvised equipment and the faces of the men arguing about it. Fletcher had commanded troops long enough to recognize the difference between a soldier seeking attention and one who genuinely believed in what he had created. Morrison turned, snapping to attention. "Sir, this equipment is unauthorized and untested. Using it could waste valuable time and resources." Fletcher approached the radio, examining it with a practiced eye that had assessed countless pieces of military hardware over a 30-year career. "How long have you been building this, Corporal Hendricks?" 3 weeks, sir. I've been conducting tests when off-duty. The transmission quality exceeds standard field equipment in every test I've performed." "And you believe it can reach 2nd Battalion through the mountain interference?" Thomas met the general's eyes. "I believe it has a significantly better chance than anything else we have available, sir. The physics of signal propagation support the design principles I've employed. I can't guarantee success, but I can guarantee that the approach is scientifically sound." Fletcher glanced at Armstrong. "How long have you been trying with conventional equipment?" 8 hours, sir. No contact on any frequency." The general made his decision with the swift certainty of someone who had learned that hesitation often cost more than wrong choices. "Set it up, Corporal. You have 30 minutes to establish contact. If it doesn't work, we proceed with other options. If it does work, you'll have earned your mockery rights. Major Armstrong, provide whatever support he needs." Morrison opened his mouth to protest, but Fletcher silenced him with a look. "Captain, we have 307 soldiers surrounded and silent. I'll try a radio made from coconuts and string if it might bring them home. Clear?" "Yes, sir," Morrison replied stiffly. Thomas and Chen moved quickly, setting up the radio system on a large table cleared for the purpose. Every eye in the communications center watched as Thomas connected the various components, his hand steady despite the pressure. He attached the antenna leads, connected the power supply from the portable generator, and began the careful process of tuning the transmitter to the optimal frequency. The device hummed to life, sounding different from the standard radios, a deeper, more resonant tone that seemed to vibrate through the wooden table. "What frequency are you using?" Armstrong asked, genuine curiosity replacing his initial skepticism. "I'm starting at 7.8 megahertz, sir. It's lower than our standard tactical frequencies, which means longer wavelength. Longer wavelengths penetrate obstacles more effectively. I'm also using amplitude modulation with enhanced carrier strength, which should maintain signal integrity through interference." Thomas put on the headphones, adjusted several dials with minute precision, and picked up the microphone. The entire room had fallen silent, dozens of people holding their breath as this strange assemblage of salvaged parts attempted what millions of dollars of military equipment could not. He cleared his throat and began transmitting. "2nd Battalion, this is Allied Headquarters, do you copy? 2nd Battalion, this is Allied Headquarters on emergency frequency 7.8 megahertz. Lieutenant Colonel Whitmore, if you can hear this transmission, please respond on this frequency. Repeat, this is Allied Headquarters calling 2nd Battalion." Static filled the room, the white noise of empty airwaves that had been the only response for 8 hours. Thomas adjusted the frequency slightly, fine-tuning the carrier wave, then tried again. More static. He glanced at the chronometer on the wall, watching precious seconds tick away from his 30-minute window. He shifted frequency again, making minute adjustments based on calculations about terrain reflection and atmospheric conditions. 2nd Battalion, this is Allied Headquarters. Colonel Whitmore, we know you are surrounded and seeking communication. We are transmitting on a low-frequency emergency band. If you have any receiver capable of tuning to approximately 7.8 megahertz, we need to establish contact immediately. Please respond on this frequency." The static continued, and Thomas saw Morrison checking his watch with obvious satisfaction, already preparing to order the equipment removed. Chen stood beside Thomas, his hand resting supportively on his shoulder. Armstrong leaned forward, wanting to believe, but years of military experience teaching him that miracles were rare and usually disappointing. Thomas closed his eyes, picturing the terrain, the distances, the way radio waves would bounce and refract through mountain valleys. He adjusted the frequency one more time, increasing power slightly, then transmitted again. 2nd Battalion, this is Headquarters. Whitmore, if you're hearing anything at all, even fragments, try to respond. We need your position, your status, and your immediate needs. Help us help you. Headquarters out." The static changed. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but Thomas's trained ear caught the shift in pattern. He held up his hand for silence, though the room was already completely quiet. He fine-tuned the receiver, adjusting for the frequency shift that might indicate an incoming transmission. The static warbled, then suddenly, cutting through the noise like a knife through fog, came a voice. "Headquarters. 2nd Battalion. Do you... We've been trying. Position surrounded. Need immediate." The words were fragmentary, broken by interference, but they were words, human words. Contact. Thomas's hands flew across the controls, adjusting everything to maximize clarity. 2nd Battalion, you are broken but readable. Say again slowly. We need your position and status. Over. The next transmission came through clearer, the voice of Sergeant Rodriguez fighting through exhaustion and relief. "Headquarters, this is 2nd Battalion Communications. We are surrounded approximately 12 miles southeast of Checkpoint Baker. 307 personnel, ammunition down to 30%, medical supplies critical. Lieutenant Colonel Whitmore requests immediate extraction or reinforcement. How did you reach us? We've been transmitting for hours." Thomas looked up at Fletcher, hardly believing what was happening. The general nodded, a slight smile crossing his weathered face. Armstrong grabbed a map, already plotting the exact coordinates. Morrison stood frozen, his expression unreadable. Chen squeezed Thomas's shoulder, whispering, "You did it." Thomas transmitted again, his voice stronger now. 2nd Battalion, We read you clearly on special equipment. Maintain this frequency for ongoing communication. Hold your position. Help is being organized now. Repeat, hold position, help is coming. What is your exact grid reference? Over the next 3 minutes, Rodriguez provided detailed coordinates, casualty reports, supply needs, and tactical situation updates. Every piece of information was critical for planning the rescue operation. The communications continued, establishing scheduled transmission times to preserve 2nd Battalion's limited power supplies while maintaining the lifeline that Thomas's homemade radio had created. Fletcher immediately began organizing the rescue operation, now armed with precise information instead of guesswork. Knowing 2nd Battalion's exact position, their condition and their capabilities allowed for careful coordination of relief forces, supply drops, and tactical movements. The information flowing through Thomas's improvised radio literally meant the difference between a desperate gamble and a calculated operation. Over the next 48 hours, that radio remained the sole link between 2nd Battalion and headquarters. The standard military equipment still could not penetrate the terrain effectively, but Thomas's modified system maintained clear communication throughout the rescue operation. He stayed at his post continuously, coordinating transmissions, relaying orders, and providing the steady voice of connection that kept 307 surrounded men from being truly alone. The rescue operation succeeded with remarkably low casualties. Supply drops arrived exactly where needed because Thomas's radio provided precise coordinates. Reinforcement units coordinated their approach perfectly because they had real-time updates on German positions from 2nd Battalion's reports. When the relief forces finally broke through and evacuated the surrounded soldiers, it was with the kind of precision that only comes from excellent intelligence and communication. Lieutenant Colonel Whitmore was among the first to enter headquarters after the evacuation, still wearing his combat-stained uniform, exhaustion etched deep in his face. He asked immediately to meet the communications team that had maintained contact. When he saw Thomas Hendricks sitting beside his makeshift radio, still monitoring the now quiet frequency, Whitmore walked directly to him. "You're the one who built this?" Whitmore asked, gesturing to the assemblage of parts. Thomas stood, suddenly aware of how informal he looked compared to the battle-hardened colonel. "Yes, sir. Corporal Thomas Hendricks." Whitmore studied the radio, then looked back at Thomas. "Sergeant Rodriguez told me this was something you built from spare parts, something everyone else thought was junk. Is that true?" "Some people found the construction methods unconventional, sir." Whitmore laughed, a sound of pure relief and genuine amusement. "Corporal, that unconventional junk saved 307 lives, mine included. Rodriguez said when your first transmission came through after hours of silence, it was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. Several men cried. I'm not ashamed to say I was one of them." Thomas felt emotion tightening his throat. "I'm just glad it worked, sir." "It did more than work," Whitmore replied. "It gave us hope when we had none, connection when we were completely isolated, and the information we needed to survive. If you ever need anything ever, you find me, understood?" Over the following weeks, the story of the homemade radio spread throughout the Allied forces. The soldiers who had mocked Thomas's work now treated him with profound respect. Private Sullivan, who had joked about building cars from boots, formally apologized and asked if Thomas could teach him basic radio principles. Technical Sergeant Chen was promoted to warrant officer and assigned to work with Thomas on communications innovation. Even Captain Morrison, though he never fully apologized, stopped dismissing unconventional approaches and began listening more carefully when technical specialists offered alternative solutions. General Fletcher ordered Thomas to train other communications personnel in the principles behind his design, recognizing that military innovation often came from practical problem-solving rather than theoretical engineering. The Signal Corps adopted several of Thomas's modifications into their standard procedures, incorporating his insights about frequency selection and power amplification into field manual revisions. His homemade radio was preserved and sent to military communications schools as a teaching tool, demonstrating that understanding fundamental principles mattered more than following established patterns. But the most profound impact was personal. Thomas received a Bronze Star for technical innovation and meritorious service, presented in a ceremony attended by many of the soldiers from 2nd Battalion. Rodriguez became a lifelong friend, and they stayed in contact for decades after the conflict ended. Whitmore wrote a detailed commendation describing how Thomas's ingenuity and persistence saved his entire battalion, ensuring the young corporal's contribution would be remembered in official records. Thomas survived the conflict and returned to Michigan, where he and his father expanded their radio repair shop into a successful electronics company. He never forgot the lesson that those hours in the command center taught him, that expertise comes in many forms, that sometimes the best solutions emerge from necessity rather than convenience, and that believing in your work matters even when everyone else doubts. The 307 soldiers of 2nd Battalion went on to participate in multiple operations before the conflict ended. Each one of them carried the memory of that voice breaking through the static. The moment when Thomas Hendricks's stubborn refusal to accept limitations created a bridge across impossible terrain. Many of them later told their families that the real lesson of war wasn't just about courage or strategy, but about the power of one person refusing to believe that problems are unsolvable, just because conventional approaches fail. In the decades following the conflict, as radio technology evolved into sophisticated satellite communications and digital systems, Thomas would sometimes tell the story of his homemade transmitter to engineering students and military personnel. He always emphasized the same points: understand your fundamentals, trust your calculations, and never let mockery stop you from pursuing solutions that might save lives. He would explain that the radio worked not because of magic or luck, but because the physics were sound and the application was appropriate for the specific problem. The copper pipe antennas, the salvaged vacuum tubes, the tin can capacitors that everyone had dismissed as junk, had performed exactly as calculated, because Thomas understood that materials mattered less than design principles. He had built something that worked, not despite its unconventional construction, but because that construction specifically addressed the unique challenges of the terrain and situation. It was a lesson about looking beyond appearances to fundamental functionality, about solving the problem in front of you rather than the problem you wish you had. Several of the soldiers from 2nd Battalion attended Thomas's funeral in 1998, all of them elderly men who had built families and careers in the decades of peace his generation had secured. They stood together at the graveside, remembering the 22-year-old corporal who had believed in physics and persistence when everyone around him believed only in regulation equipment and established procedures. Rodriguez, who had become an electrical engineering professor, gave a eulogy describing Thomas as someone who understood that innovation required both knowledge and courage, the willingness to be right when everyone else thought you were wrong. The Military Communications Museum in Maryland still displays Thomas Hendricks's original radio, mounted in a climate-controlled case with a detailed placard explaining its history. Students studying military signals intelligence pause before it, initially amused by its improvised appearance, then sobered when they read about the 307 lives it saved. The exhibit includes Rodriguez's original headphones from 2nd Battalion, preserved alongside Thomas's soldering iron and a photograph of the young corporal working at his makeshift bench. What the exhibit doesn't fully capture is the broader principle that Thomas's story illustrated. That rigid adherence to established methods can become its own form of failure when circumstances demand creative solutions. His radio worked because he understood that the question wasn't whether equipment looked professional, but whether it solved the specific problem effectively. He built what the situation needed, rather than what regulations prescribed, and in doing so, he demonstrated a kind of practical wisdom that transcends any particular technology or era. The soldiers who had initially mocked him learned something equally valuable. They discovered that dismissing unconventional approaches without serious evaluation was not professional skepticism but intellectual laziness. They learned to distinguish between ideas that were genuinely flawed and ideas that were merely different from expectation. Several of them carried that lesson into their post-conflict careers, becoming leaders who encouraged innovation rather than suppressing it, who evaluated proposals based on merit rather than conformity. The story also highlighted how wartime necessity accelerated problem-solving, in ways that peacetime bureaucracy never could. Thomas had the freedom to experiment because he did so during off-duty hours with salvaged materials, operating outside official channels, until the moment when official channels had nothing left to offer. When confronted with 307 silent soldiers and no conventional solutions, the system briefly allowed unconventional alternatives to prove their worth. That moment of institutional flexibility, forced by desperate circumstances, created space for innovation that saved hundreds of lives. General Fletcher, in his post-conflict memoirs, wrote extensively about the radio incident, using it as an example of leadership requiring the wisdom to know when to suspend normal rules. He argued that commanders who could only follow doctrine were administrators, not leaders, and that true military effectiveness required recognizing when situations demanded deviation from standard practice. He credited Thomas Hendricks with teaching him that lesson in reverse, that sometimes the people lowest in the hierarchy understand problems better than those at the top, and that rank should enable effective action rather than obstruct it. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.